In the 1st century, a Roman slave named Pallas belonged to an emperor's household. Within a generation, he was richer than every senator in Rome combined. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how and why it should terrify anyone who thinks rank always means money. Rome ran on a ladder more rigid than almost any society in history. Free birth, wealth, and blood decided everything on paper. But paper and reality in Rome were two very different documents, because at every rank of Roman society, there was a number, a census value, a price, a wage, and behind every number, a life that the number rarely told the truth about. Today we climb it, rung by rung. The slave, the laborer, the legionary, the equestrian, the senator, and then we open the books on the freedmen who broke the entire system from the inside. This is Rank and Ledger. In today's episode, Roman society, rank by rank, what each life was worth, what that number actually bought, and who truly held the empire's wealth. We start at the very bottom with a person who was, by Roman law, not quite a person at all. One thing before we climb. If you want to see who really gets paid in worlds like this, empires, armies, criminal syndicates, subscribe now and leave a like. It genuinely decides whether this channel survives. In the 1st century, as much as a third of Italy's population was enslaved. Some worked mines and quarries, worked and beaten to death within a few brutal years. Others worked inside wealthy households and lived a very different life entirely. And even within slavery, there was a whole hidden ladder of its own. A farm slave and a mine slave lived brutal, short lives with almost no hope of savings. An educated household slave, a tutor or an accountant, could live for decades, travel with his owner, and quietly build the very peculium that might one day buy his name back. A slave had no wage. He had a price. An ordinary slave might cost several hundred denarii. A skilled slave, a scribe, a doctor, a musician, could cost many times more. But Roman law allowed something almost nowhere else in the ancient world. Did it scale? A slave could earn his own small savings, called a peculium, tips, gifts, side work, and slowly buy his own freedom. That single legal detail, the peculium, is the crack in the ladder that this whole episode is really about, because it meant a slave's fortune was not always capped by his rank. Now remember that. We will return to it. Here is your first question and answer it honestly in the comments below. If freedom could be bought with savings, was Roman slavery a life sentence? Or was it, for some, simply the empire's cruelest, longest job interview? Tell me below. And manumission itself was a real ceremony, not a rumor. A magistrate touched the slave with a rod, spoke a formula, and by the next morning, the man who had been property was, on paper, a Roman citizen. His old master often became his patron for life, owed loyalty in exchange for the freedom that had been granted. But freedom on its own bought no security in the city. Next, the free man's daily scramble. One rung up stands the free citizen with nothing but his own 2 hands, which in Rome was barely a rung at all. A free, unskilled laborer in the city, a porter, a builder's hand, a sewer cleaner, earned around 1 denarius a day. 4 sesterces, enough for bread, cheap wine, and a roof if he was careful. And here is the sentence that should stop you. A free laborer's daily wage was barely more than what many slave owners spent simply feeding a slave for that same day. Freedom in Rome did not always outprice bondage. It just came with the dignity of choosing your own hunger. And work was never guaranteed. A free laborer competed every single morning against slave labor that cost his employer nothing but upkeep. Freedom did not just fail to guarantee wealth in Rome. Some mornings, it barely guaranteed a job at all. So the Roman state fed its poorest citizens directly. The grain dole, the cura annoni, gave free or heavily subsidized grain to some 200,000 men in the city of Rome. Bread was politics, not charity. And every morning, the poor citizen performed a ritual that decided whether he ate that week at all. He walked to a wealthy patron's house, stood in line with dozens of others, and greeted him. In return, the patron handed him a small daily gift called the sportula. The poet Martial complained about it constantly. A handful of coins, worth perhaps 6 sesterces, for an entire morning's bowing and scraping. Dignity in Rome had a listed price, and it was cheap. And the whole system was held together by spectacle. Politicians and emperors funded free bread and free games, gladiators, chariot races, wild beast hunts, precisely because a fed and entertained crowd rarely asks who is growing richer above them. The poet Juvenal had a name for it: bread and circuses. Above that unstable scramble stood a rank with a fixed wage on paper, and a very different set of costs hidden underneath it. Above the laborer stood a man who traded his labor for something the empire valued more than money: discipline, obedience, and a willingness to die on command. A legionary in Caesar's time earned 225 denarii a year. Later, under the emperor Domitian, the rate rose to 300, roughly a denarius a day, the same as the free city laborer, but paid on a fixed schedule, in 3 or 4 installments. But the payslip lied about the take-home. Real Roman military pay records survive, and they show the army deducting money for food, for boots, for tent mates, for a burial fund, straight from the soldier's stipend before he ever touched a coin. On some surviving records, after every deduction, a legionary is left with almost nothing in hand for that entire pay period. He fought for Rome, and Rome billed him for the privilege. Camp life was brutal even without battle. A legionary marched under a heavy pack the soldiers themselves called, half-joking, Marius's mules, dug a new fortified camp almost every single night, and could be flogged or executed for falling asleep on watch. The stipendium paid for all of that too. So, why serve 25 years for that? Because the real prize came at the end. A discharge bonus of land, or a lump sum of 3,000 denarii, roughly 10 years of a legionary's paper wage, paid all at once, if he survived long enough to collect it. Above the ordinary legionary stood the centurion, and here the ladder finally jumps. A centurion under Domitian earned roughly 5,000 denarii a year, 13 to 17 times an ordinary soldier's pay. And the very senior centurion of a legion, the primus Pallas, earned roughly 4 times that again, close to 20,000 denarii a year. A single retirement at that rank could set a family up for generations. And centurions were often promoted up from the ranks, not born into privilege. It was one of the very few honest ladders in the whole Roman system, hard, violent, and genuinely climbable on merit and survival alone. Pause the video here and guess. What was the minimum personal fortune, in sesterces, a Roman man needed simply to be allowed into the Senate? And remember Pallas from the opening, a former slave who blew straight past whatever number you are about to guess. Type your guess in the comments before I tell you. I will wait, because one rung up from the centurion, the number needed to even qualify, jumps into a different universe entirely. Locked in your guess? Because the real jump in this ladder is not the centurion. It is the wall of money that stood between every soldier alive and the ruling class above him. To even be considered an equestrian, a Roman knight, a man needed a census fortune of 400,000 sesterces, roughly 100,000 denarii, plus 3 generations of free birth in his family. Money alone was not enough. Money had to be old, or old enough. Many equestrians started as successful merchants or provincial businessmen, men the old blood nobility privately looked down on. No matter how many ledgers of gold they controlled, money could buy the census qualification. It could not buy the right accent. Equestrians were Rome's business class. Bankers, tax farmers, large landowners, trade financiers. They were richer than most senators in practice, but by law they were still one social rank below them. And it was the equestrian class that ran the machine of provincial taxation. Companies of equestrian investors, called the publicani, bid for the right to collect a province's taxes, paid Rome a fixed sum up front, and kept anything extra they could squeeze out. There was no real limit on the extra. An entire province could be quietly bled for a single equestrian syndicate's profit, and it rarely made it back to Rome as anything but a rumor. Occasionally, it did make it back, and it ended a career. In the year 70 BC, the orator Cicero prosecuted a former governor of Sicily named Verres, accusing him of looting the province for personal fortune on a staggering scale. Cicero's own words survive. He called it, quite simply, organized theft wearing a toga. Verres fled into exile rather than face the verdict. It proved the theft was real. It also proved something darker. Rome could occasionally punish the crime, but only when a case became famous enough to embarrass the whole ruling class into acting. And above even the men who profited from provinces, sat the rank that made its own rules about money entirely. Here is your second question for the comments. If money alone could not buy you into the Senate, but it could buy you an entire province's tax revenue to squeeze, was equestrian rank at the ceiling? Or was it simply a different, quieter kind of throne? Tell me below. Above the equestrian, at the very top of the official ladder, sat the men who actually ran Rome. Here is your answer. To sit in the Senate, a Roman man needed a personal fortune of 1 million sesterces, 250,000 denarii, 2.5 times the equestrian threshold, and it had to be in land, not trade. That land requirement was deliberate. Senators were forbidden from directly engaging in trade or banking, the very businesses that made equestrians rich. The ruling class wanted its wealth to look old, rooted, respectable. Reality, as always in Rome, found a way around the rule. And the senatorial career itself, the cursus honorum, was not free to climb either. A man running for high office was expected to personally fund public games and grain handouts for the city, sometimes spending a fortune simply to be allowed to keep climbing. The ladder charged admission at every single rung, all the way to the top. A senator lived on rents from vast estates worked by hundreds, sometimes thousands, of the very slaves we met at the bottom of this ladder. His entire fortune was, quite literally, built floor by floor on the rank furthest beneath him. So, here is the shape of the official ladder. The slave was owned. The laborer was barely fed. The legionary was billed for his own war. The equestrian bought a province's blood as profit. The senator sat on top of all of it, on paper the richest man in Rome. But remember Pallas, the slave from the very first scene of this video? Because the official ladder was about to be broken, not from the top, but from the one rank Rome swore was worth nothing at all. Because the richest man in Rome was never a senator at all. Pallas began his life enslaved in the imperial household. Freed, he rose to manage the Emperor Claudius's personal finances, the entire imperial treasury, in effect, the emperor's private accountant. The Roman historian Tacitus records it plainly. Pallas amassed a personal fortune of some 300 million sesterces, 300 times the senatorial minimum. A former piece of property had become richer than the entire Senate combined. It gets stranger. Pallas was so powerful that a sitting senator once formally proposed in the Senate itself that Pallas be awarded the honorary regalia of a praetor, one of Rome's highest offices, purely as thanks for his service. The Senate voted yes. Men born to rule were officially thanking a former slave for permission to keep their own privileges. He was not alone. Another freedman, Narcissus, secretary to the same emperor, is recorded by Tacitus and Pliny at some 400 million sesterces. Two former slaves, richer than any senator alive. Legally, they could never sit in the Senate. Their blood was wrong, their birth was wrong, their toga could never carry the purple stripe. But they controlled the emperor's ear, his correspondence, his treasury. Rank said nothing. Proximity to power said everything. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder was disgusted by it and said so in writing that survives to this day. He noted that Pallas and men like him held more real wealth and power than the old republican nobility ever had, gained not through birth, but through sitting one desk closer to the money. And it began with the peculium, the small hidden savings of an enslaved man, the very detail I asked you to remember at the start. That crack in the ladder, multiplied by imperial trust and decades of patient positioning, became the largest private fortune in Rome. So here is the final ledger of Roman society. The slave had a price and, if very fortunate, a hidden crack toward freedom. The laborer was barely richer than the property he was not. The legionary was billed for his own war and paid at the end if he survived it. The equestrian bought provinces as profit. The senator sat on land built on other men's backs, and the freedman owned once, outbought every single one of them. Rome built the most rigid rank system in the ancient world, and its richest man still climbed straight through the bottom of it. The ledger, in the end, never cared what the law said your rank was worth. So, here is your last question, and it is the one that matters most. If a slave could out-earn a senator 2,000 years ago, has rank ever really controlled money? Or has money always quietly controlled rank? Tell me below. I read every comment. Next time on Rank and Ledger, we climb one of two ladders and you decide which. The CIA or a hedge fund? Vote in the comments. And if this story held you, do the two things that keep this channel climbing. Leave a like and subscribe. The ladder continues.